The Panasonic KX-TGF570 Freakshow. Some time ago, between 8 months and a year, the grandmother started complaining about the telephones that she had. Her and my grandfather had a set of Uniden 1580 telephones, this model. And they'd had it for a long time. I would say it was in service for almost a decade. And I thought it was a great phone. And she liked it as well. But then she started saying that certain calls weren't clear and the answer machine wasn't right. I think she described the answer machine as blurry, which was kind of comical. And so anyways, so I went over there and looked at the telephones, and I really couldn't find anything wrong with them. And so I think what was happening was certain people would call probably from an iPhone because this is going to stir up a comments mess, but the reality is, for whatever reason, the call quality on the iPhone is deplorable, which I don't quite understand why, because I've seen videos recorded on an iPhone and I've heard audio recordings recorded on an iPhone and they sound fine. So I don't know what happens to the microphone between the recording of a video and the capturing of a call, but something happens and the call quality is absolutely deplorable. So what I did was I called on my telephone, which is not an iPhone, and I recorded a message and it was perfectly clear. And then I had my grandfather call on his iPhone, which is particularly bad because he has some kind of a case thing on it, and the message was a garbled, inaudible disaster. And so I thought I'd explain to her clearly that the problem is not the telephones, it's the callers, because people just don't call from good equipment and they don't speak into the telephone. There's a lot of people that will put it on speaker and then talk away from it, or they'll put their hand around the bottom of it and cover the microphone, or things like they don't speak into the phone correctly. And so then you have a call which is starting out to be a quality fail in the first place, and then it gets even worse because they don't speak into it clearly, and it just becomes a completely inaudible scenario. And so that, I think, is what's happening, because I had talked on the phone over there plenty of times, talked to them on that phone all the time, and it worked fine. It was just certain calls from people that I know were calling on an iPhone that were not clear. And so anyways, I explained that to her, but she kept complaining that it wasn't clear. And so finally I decided to just get them new phones. So I bought for them the Panasonic KX-TGF570 that is seen here. I do have some experience with this telephone. I use it at work. I use it very basically. Not basically as a filler word, but basically in the sense that I just turn it on and off. I don't use any of the features. I don't really use speakerphone. I don't use the headset jack. I just place and answer calls. Don't use the answer machine, nothing. Just answer receive calls. And for that purpose, it works fine. But the grandparents, or at least my grandmother anyways, likes to use the speakerphone. And I think they do they make certain calls where they both talk, and so they use the speakerphone in that case, obviously. And I guess that's not obvious. They could have talked on two handsets. But anyways, the point was, they were complaining that the audio was very quiet. And I noticed an immediate degrade in audio quality when I put this phone in, when I would call them. So what was happening was, when I would talk on my phone to them on this phone, the audio that I got from them would be overly distorted, way too much input. And I think what was happening was one of two things. The grandmother likes to talk on speakerphone, and she tends to kind of shout on the phone. So these phones, I find that the pickup is extremely sensitive, and so it would already be a bit too loud because she was talking too loud. But then she put it on speakerphone, and because the speakerphone volume wasn't loud enough, she would keep it very close to her face, and so then she would be shouting into the telephone with it on the speakerphone when it's more sensitive, and it was an overloaded, distorted mess. I just lived with it because it wasn't worth the trouble of getting another phone. But then over time, I started to get complaints about this phone because the audio was too low. And my grandfather doesn't hear that well anymore. And so for him, it was a problem because he wasn't hearing what people were saying on the phone. So I went over there again to check it out, and I agreed with them that the audio volume was kind of low, but they didn't seem to want new phones. They just, I don't know, for whatever reason, they wanted to live with it. So then my grandfather was trying to cut money on the cable bill, so I ended up changing their phone service over to Magic Jack. And then the call quality, I couldn't live with it. She would call me, and the audio was so loud it would clip out because it was so overloaded speaking into that phone. And it was the same issue. She couldn't hear, the grandfather couldn't hear on the phone, and she thought the speakerphone was too quiet. It was out of control. So I got them a set of Clarity phones, and all the problems immediately went away. The outgoing audio returned to a normal volume level. It was clear, it didn't clip out at all. The grandfather can hear on the phone again, he hears every word on the phone. And so these Clarity phones are working fantastic. Completely solved the problem. I was impressed, really, because I've used these before, and I know they were louder, but I didn't realize it would be like a night and day difference. I mean, he can hear it now. So anyways, Clarity phones working perfectly with the Magic Jack, no issues. And the problem was not the Magic Jack, because when these were first put into service, they still had phone service from Comcast, and the audio wasn't right then either. So the bottom line is, this was a mess, and these are working. So my question becomes, what happened to Panasonic? Because years ago, they always kind of had this reputation of being like the high-end phone brand. And I find that kind of intriguing, because if you look at the different offerings that were out there at the time, Uniden for instance, Uniden had a number of telephones that were really, really high-end, really expensive, and really, really high quality. Take the True series, the True 5.8 series for instance. Those were really high quality phones. They were probably as expensive as Panasonic, if not more expensive, and they performed just fine. They performed really well, actually. And you go back into the 900 megahertz era, you had phones like the EXS9660 and a plethora of other digital or Digitan spread spectrum models that were top of the line, expensive, and outperformed Panasonic. I've used Panasonic 900 megahertz spread spectrum phones, and they don't have the same range or the same clarity or the same reliability as the Unidens did and still do. So I don't quite understand why Panasonic had that reputation. I think it may be because they didn't sell any economy models. Because Uniden sold some economy models, and they were just, some of them were awful. There's no beating around the bush. They were just bad. And VTech sold a lot of economy models as well. VTech being the cheaper brand, AT&T being the same product but of a slightly higher quality, supposedly. And so I think VTech kind of got a bad reputation because of that. And then VTech, although they pioneered the 5.8 gigahertz era, they, to my knowledge, did not release a single completely 5.8 gigahertz phone. All of their 5.8 gigahertz phones were dual band. And they got a lot of backlash for that when they first came out. Panasonic, I think, never released a dual band 5.8, and Uniden had both. If you bought a cheaper Uniden that was 5.8, it was going to be a dual band that probably was not very good. So I guess that's why they had that reputation. Looking back at like the 2.4, 5.8 gigahertz era from Panasonic, by and large, most of the phones, when you took them out of the box, they just plain worked. It didn't have a lot of issues. The audio quality was generally fine. But the reality became that they did not stand the test of time. The batteries were atrocious on a lot of the 5.8 gigahertz models. And there were complaints about that. If you look through the reviews on that time period, there was a lot of complaints about the batteries going out real quick. So that was certainly an issue. And then as the decade went on, we're starting to see display failures in the Panasonic phones, which is something that VTech was plagued with and AT&T was plagued with. And now Panasonic is seeming to develop the issue as the time is going on. Different issue, though. I don't think it's a failing cable like it is on the VTech phones and the AT&T phones. I don't know how to fix the Panasonic screen failures. And then we have Uniden. 2 or 3 decades have gone by on some of their pieces, and their screens are all working just fine still. Now, when the DEC 6 era came out, the earlier DEC 6 phones had most of the same issues that the 5.8 phones did. They were widely liked by consumers, but a lot of them had battery issues still. It wasn't until the DEC 6 Plus era came out where the battery issues seemed to completely disappear, and I don't think any of the DEC 6 Plus models ate batteries like the previous DEC 6 5.8, 2.4, or 900 megahertz models did. Now, with the introduction of the DEC 6 Plus era, there seemed to be a period of time where they had really good quality phones. I think, if I recall correctly, it came out sometime in around 2012, maybe 2010, early 2010s, I believe, is when 6 Plus came out. And so it was like early 2010s to mid 2010s, I would say, was the peak of Panasonic phone quality, because the battery issues was resolved, the range was excellent on some of those 6 Plus models. They were still pretty pricey, but you got what you paid for. They were really solid phones. And I think that was kind of the last time that we saw a really good product from Panasonic. Because I've worked with a number of the models that they have on the market now, and they are a disaster. I had done a video of a set that I purchased earlier, I think it might have even been last year, earlier in this year. I did a video on that set, a couple of videos, and that set was awful because the speakerphone, it just didn't work. And it wasn't a defect. Some people were getting in the box saying it was a defect. It wasn't defective, because I got another one from a year or two earlier, and it worked the same way. So that model was just an atrocity. And then I tried that waterproof phone, which I really wanted to like, and that was an atrocity as well. A feedback Freakshow, a speakerphone issue, and again, I tried 2 of them, different purchase dates, significantly different purchase dates, and they had the same issue. So then we have the Panasonic KX-TGF570, which seems to be one of the more popular models out there today. And I'm left asking what happened. Because I almost got through this video. Okay, anyways, what I was saying, the problem is with this phone is the speakerphone volume is way too low, which I don't think has really ever been an issue in the past with Panasonic. There was one model that comes to mind, the KX-TGF570, that has some complaints about the earpiece volume being low, but this is ridiculous on this phone. The speakerphone volume is totally inaudible. Or inadequate, rather. It's audible, but it's inadequate. And I don't understand why, because the ringer isn't particularly quiet, but the speakerphone is just not really loud enough. And you can hear it in a very, very quiet environment, but in a real world scenario, whenever I've used it, I've always wanted it to go louder. So I just don't understand what is happening to Panasonic they're slipping. They're making products that do not live up to the expectation that they have developed over the years, and that are, quite frankly, unsatisfactory. This is a very expensive phone, and yet the speakerphone is almost useless. Speakerphone on the base is loud, but I find that the pickup is terrible, because I've tried to use the base speakerphone at work, and people can't hear what's going on. So, I don't know what the deal is here, but I think I'm kind of ending my relationship with Panasonic, and if I was to buy a new telephone, I would look at an AT&T first, because I've been very happy with everything from AT&T that I've worked with that was made recently. And they seem to be holding up well too. I have an AT&T cordless phone at work, which cost a fraction of the Panasonic, and it doesn't really have any of the complaints that I have with it, and it's still working just fine. So, I don't know what's going on, but the tables are turning here for Panasonic.